The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a decorated United States Marine on his first day of leave in London. He wore his dress blue uniform with pride, the ribbons on his chest telling stories of 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless acts of valor. Rodriguez had saved every penny for this trip. After losing his best friend in Kandahar 6 months earlier, he needed to get away from everything that reminded him of war. London seemed like the perfect escape, historic, peaceful, and far from the desert heat that still haunted his dreams. His sister had insisted he visit the palace, saying it would be good for him to see something beautiful and ceremonial after all the chaos he had experienced. On the other side of the courtyard, Lance Corporal James Wellington adjusted his iconic red tunic and checked his bearskin hat one final time. At 24 years old, he had served in the Coldstream Guards for 6 years, following a family tradition that stretched back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had stood guard during World War II, his grandfather during the Korean War, and his father during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. James took immense pride in being part of this living piece of British history. But James carried his own hidden burden. 3 weeks earlier, he had received news that his younger brother, a Royal Navy officer, had been killed in a training accident. The funeral had been held with full military honors. Yet James had been unable to attend due to his duties at the palace. The guilt ate at him daily, and he channeled his grief into an even more rigid adherence to protocol and tradition. The crowd began to thicken as tour groups and individual visitors positioned themselves for the best view of the ceremony. Children pressed against the palace gates while parents held up phones and cameras. Street performers entertained the waiting masses, and vendors sold miniature Union Jack flags and postcards. Rodriguez found himself pushed toward the front of the crowd by the growing number of spectators behind him. He didn't mind. His height advantage allowed him to see clearly over most people's heads. As he stood there, he noticed the precision with which the guards moved, their discipline evident in every step. It reminded him of his own military training. Though the pageantry was unlike anything he had experienced in the Corps, James began his measured pace along his assigned route, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This was his sanctuary, the repetitive motion, the weight of tradition, the absolute certainty of every movement. In these moments, he could forget about his brother, about his inability to say goodbye, about the hollow feeling that had consumed him since receiving that terrible phone call. As James approached the section of his route closest to the crowd, something caught his peripheral vision. A figure in military dress uniform standing among the civilians. James had been trained to notice details, to spot anything unusual or potentially threatening. While foreign military personnel visiting the palace wasn't uncommon, something about this particular individual's bearing commanded attention. Rodriguez, meanwhile, found himself studying the guard's movements with professional interest. He recognized the discipline it took to maintain such perfect posture and timing. Hour after hour, day after day, the Marine in him respected the dedication, even as he wondered how anyone could perform the same routine without going insane from boredom. The moment their eyes met was purely accidental. James had completed a turn and was beginning his march back when his gaze briefly shifted toward the crowd. Rodriguez happened to be adjusting his position at exactly the same instant. For just a fraction of a second, their eyes locked. What should have been a momentary acknowledgement between 2 servicemen instead stretched into something more intense. James saw the ribbons on Rodriguez's uniform, recognizing combat decorations even from a distance. Rodriguez saw the rigid professionalism of a soldier carrying invisible weight, something he knew all too well. Neither man looked away. The crowd, initially focused on the approaching ceremony, began to notice the unusual stillness. Conversations quieted as people followed the guards' and Marines' respective gazes. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Cameras that had been casually recording suddenly focused with purpose. James felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced since his brother's death, a connection to another human being who understood the weight of military service. But protocol demanded he continue his patrol. Yet something about Rodriguez's steady gaze held him frozen in place. Rodriguez recognized the look in the guard's eyes because he had seen it in his own mirror countless times since returning from deployment. It was the look of someone carrying grief, someone struggling to maintain composure while the world expected them to be unbreakable. His sister had told him that meeting other veterans could be healing, but she probably hadn't meant this kind of meeting. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Other guards continued their routines, unaware that their colleague had broken from the prescribed pattern. The crowd's murmur grew louder as more people realized something unusual was happening. Tour guides tried to explain the normal procedure, while obviously confused by the deviation they were witnessing. A small child near Rodriguez tugged on his mother's sleeve, asking why the soldier in the red coat wasn't moving anymore. The mother shushed her daughter, but the question hung in the air. Everyone was wondering the same thing, but none of them could see what the two men saw in each other's eyes. The weight of expectation pressed down on both servicemen. James knew he should resume his patrol, that sergeant majors would have questions if this continued much longer. Rodriguez knew he should look away, perhaps move back into the crowd to break the strange spell that had fallen over the courtyard. But neither man moved. The standoff had begun, and everyone present could feel that something significant was unfolding before their eyes, even if they couldn't understand what it was. The silence stretched beyond what anyone in the crowd had ever experienced during a palace visit. What had begun as a curious pause in the guard's routine was transforming into something that felt almost sacred. The usual chatter of tourists died away as hundreds of people found themselves unconsciously holding their breath. Rodriguez felt sweat beginning to form under his dress uniform, despite the cool London morning. Every instinct told him to break eye contact, to step back into the anonymity of the crowd, to end whatever this was before it went too far. But something deeper kept him rooted in place. In James's unwavering gaze, he saw a reflection of his own struggle to maintain composure in a world that demanded strength from those who had already given everything. James's hands remained steady on his rifle, but inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs. 6 years of flawless service. 6 years of never breaking protocol. 6 years of being the perfect example of British military precision. And now, he stood frozen like a statue, unable to look away from a stranger who somehow understood his pain without speaking a word. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd whispered to her husband, "Something's not right here, Harold. Guards don't stop like this." Her voice carried in the unusual quiet, and several people around her nodded in agreement. A teenager with a smartphone began filming, sensing that he might be capturing something extraordinary. Behind the palace gates, other members of the Coldstream Guards continued their duties, but more than one had noticed James's deviation from routine. Corporal Davies, stationed at the main entrance, caught sight of the situation and felt his own stomach tighten with anxiety. He had known James since basic training and had watched his friend struggle with grief over the past weeks. This public break from protocol could end James's career, but Davies also understood that some things were more important than careers. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the gathering that something unusual was happening. A group of American college students on a European tour pushed closer, their guide explaining in hushed tones that this was definitely not part of the normal ceremony. Japanese tourists bowed respectfully, sensing the solemnity of the moment even without understanding its source. Rodriguez thought about his fallen friend, Corporal Jenkins, who had died in his arms after an improvised explosive device tore through their convoy. Jenkins had always talked about visiting London after their deployment, about seeing the guards and the crown jewels. Now Rodriguez was here, living the dream his friend would never experience, staring into the eyes of a British soldier who carried his own invisible wounds. The Marines' ribbons caught the sunlight, and James found himself reading the decorations from memory. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, with V device for Valor, Combat Action Ribbon, Afghanistan Campaign Medal. Each piece of colored fabric represented pain, sacrifice, and courage that most civilians would never understand. James's own chest bore different ribbons: Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, Afghanistan Operational Service Medal. But the weight they carried was the same. A young mother lifted her toddler son to her hip, pointing toward the two men. "Look, Thomas," she whispered. "Soldiers from different countries. The child stared with wide eyes, somehow sensing the importance of what he was witnessing, even though he lacked the words to express it. Other children in the crowd grew quiet, picking up on the adults' tension and reverence. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Palace security began taking notice, but the crowd's respectful silence kept them from immediate intervention. This wasn't a disruption or a threat. It was something none of them had encountered before. A superintendent quietly radioed for guidance while keeping a careful eye on both men. James felt memories flooding back despite his efforts to maintain focus. His brother's laughter during their last phone call. The proud smile on their father's face when both sons had chosen military service. The telegram that had shattered his world. The funeral he had missed because duty demanded he stand guard at a palace while his family buried their hero. Rodriguez saw his own ghosts reflected in the guard's steady gaze. The village children in Afghanistan, who had waved at his convoy the day before the bombing. His sister's tears at the airport when he left for his final deployment. The letter he had written to Jenkins's parents but never found the courage to send. The nightmares that still woke him 3 times a week. A group of military veterans in the crowd began to recognize what was happening. An old man wearing a Royal British Legion pin elbowed his companion, a woman with a U.S. Army cap, and nodded toward the 2 soldiers. Without speaking, both veterans stepped slightly forward, creating an unofficial barrier between the crowd and the 2 men, giving them space for whatever this moment required. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around the palace and carrying the distant sounds of London traffic. James's bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned despite the breeze, his training overriding even this unprecedented situation. Rodriguez's dress blue uniform stayed crisp and proper, his military bearing never wavering even as his soul felt raw and exposed. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman began to cry softly. She couldn't explain why, but something about the 2 young men's silent communication touched a deep place in her heart. Her tears were noticed by others, and several people found themselves unexpectedly emotional as they witnessed what felt like a profound moment of human connection. The palace clock tower chimed the quarter hour, its deep tones echoing across the courtyard. Neither soldier moved. The crowd had grown to over 300 people, all of them somehow understanding that they were witnessing something rare and meaningful. Tour buses continued to arrive, but their passengers quickly fell silent upon seeing the scene. James's commanding officer, Major Thompson, approached carefully from inside the palace grounds. He had served 2 tours in Iraq and recognized the look in his soldiers' eyes. Instead of immediately intervening, Thompson positioned himself where he could act quickly if needed while allowing the moment to continue. He had lost good men under his command, and understood that sometimes healing required breaking the rules. 22 minutes had passed since the first moment of eye contact, and the courtyard had transformed into something resembling a cathedral. The crowd, now numbering nearly 500 people, maintained an almost religious silence. Children clung to their parents' hands, sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the street performers had stopped their acts, drawn into the magnetic pull of the confrontation unfolding before them. Rodriguez felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and survivor's guilt that had lived there since Jenkins's death. Looking into James's eyes was like looking into a mirror that reflected not his appearance, but his soul. Here was another warrior who understood the cost of serving something greater than himself, who knew what it meant to carry the weight of fallen comrades. James's breathing had become deliberately controlled, the way he had been taught to manage stress during his training. But this wasn't stress. This was something far more complex. For the first time since his brother's death, he felt truly seen by another human being. The American Marine standing before him carried the same burden of responsibility. The same question that haunted James's sleepless nights. Why was I spared when others weren't? A BBC News camera crew arrived, having received reports of an unusual incident at the palace. The cameraman began filming from a respectful distance, instinctively understanding that this wasn't a situation to exploit but rather a moment to preserve. The reporter, a veteran war correspondent who had covered conflicts around the world, immediately recognized what she was witnessing and instructed her crew to capture everything with dignity and reverence. The crowd parted slightly to allow the news crew through, but the movement was careful and quiet. Even strangers were protecting the sanctity of whatever was happening between the two soldiers. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip stood in perfect formation, unconsciously mimicking the military bearing they were observing. Major Thompson received a radio message from Palace Security, requesting guidance on how to handle the situation. The incident had been noticed by senior staff, and questions were being asked about protocol violations. Thompson studied James's face through his binoculars and made a decision that would later be debated in military circles for years. He radioed back that the situation was under control and requested permission to let it continue. Rodriguez began to remember why he had joined the Marines in the first place. Not for glory or adventure, but because he believed in protecting something precious. Standing here, seeing the dedication in James's unwavering stance, feeling the respect and attention of hundreds of strangers, he remembered that his service had meant something. Jenkins's sacrifice had meant something. The pain they carried was the price of caring about things worth protecting. An elderly man in the crowd stepped forward slightly. He wore a faded military jacket with Korean War veteran patches, and his weathered hands shook as he saluted both soldiers. The gesture was noticed by others, and slowly, one by one, other veterans in the crowd began to salute as well. A World War II survivor, a Vietnam veteran, a Gulf War Marine, a Iraq War soldier. Each salute was held with dignity and respect, creating a silent honor guard around the two main participants. James saw the salutes in his peripheral vision, and for the first time in weeks, felt pride instead of guilt about wearing his uniform. These people understood that military service was about more than following orders or maintaining traditions. It was about standing up when others couldn't, about bearing witness to both the beauty and the horror of the world, about choosing to serve even when the cost was personal pain. The moment reached a crescendo when a small girl, no more than 6 years old, broke free from her mother's hand and walked toward the space between Rodriguez and James. The crowd gasped collectively, expecting someone to stop her. But something about her innocent confidence made everyone freeze. She stood in the center of the invisible line connecting the two soldiers and looked up at each of them in turn. "Are you sad?" she asked Rodriguez in a clear, piping voice that carried across the silent courtyard. Rodriguez felt his eyes begin to water despite his military training. The simple question cut through all the complex emotions he had been struggling with for months. Yes. He was sad, desperately, overwhelmingly sad, but he was also honored to have served alongside heroes like Jenkins. Proud to wear his uniform. Grateful to be alive to tell their stories. "Yes," he answered quietly, his voice carrying to James and the nearby crowd members. "But I'm honored too." James felt something break open in his chest when he heard those words. The guilt that had been consuming him began to transform into something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding that grief and pride could coexist. His brother had died serving his country, and James was alive to serve his. Both facts could be true simultaneously, without diminishing either. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if Rodriguez's answer made perfect sense to her. She turned to James with the same serious expression. "Are you sad too?" she asked. James had never spoken to a civilian while on duty. It violated every protocol he had ever learned. But looking down at this brave little girl who had somehow understood what hundreds of adults had only sensed, he found his voice. "Yes," he said, his words crisp despite the emotion behind them. "But I'm proud too." "Proud too." The girl smiled then, a radiant expression that seemed to lift some invisible weight from the entire courtyard. She looked back and forth between the two soldiers one more time, then skipped back to her mother, who scooped her up with tears streaming down her face. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the casual clapping of tourists who had witnessed a performance. It was the deep, sustained applause of people who had been present for something profound and transformative. The sound washed over Rodriguez and James like a benediction, acknowledging their service, their sacrifice, and their humanity. Rodriguez felt his military bearing relax slightly, not into casualness but into something more authentic. He had been standing at rigid attention for nearly half an hour, but now his posture conveyed strength without brittleness, pride without arrogance. The weight he had been carrying felt lighter, shared somehow with everyone present. James maintained his formal stance but felt the stone wall around his heart beginning to crumble. For weeks, he had believed that showing emotion would dishonor. As the applause began to fade, Rodriguez and James continued to hold each other's gaze, but the intensity had transformed from desperate recognition into mutual respect and understanding. The storm of emotion that had frozen them both in place was settling into something calmer but no less meaningful. They had found what they both needed: acknowledgement from someone who truly understood the weight they carried. Rodriguez slowly lifted his right hand to his brow in a perfect military salute, holding it with the precision and respect that had been drilled into him through years of service. The gesture was witnessed by the entire crowd. But it was meant for James alone. A recognition of one warrior by another. An acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, and a moment of gratitude for the unexpected healing they had provided each other. James's response came without hesitation, despite violating every protocol he had ever learned about maintaining position while on duty. His right hand rose to mirror Rodriguez's salute, held with the same precision and dignity that his family had demonstrated for 4 generations of military service. In that moment, he honored not just the American Marine before him, but his fallen brother, his proud heritage, and his own commitment to serving something greater than himself. The crowd erupted again, but this time the applause was mixed with cheers, tears, and expressions of awe. Hundreds of cameras captured the moment as the 2 soldiers held their mutual salute for 10 full seconds. An eternity in military time, but a brief moment in the scope of human connection. When they finally lowered their hands, the spell that had held the courtyard was gently broken. But its effects would linger for years. Major Thompson approached from behind the palace gates, his own eyes slightly moist, despite his military bearing. He had commanded soldiers in combat zones, and understood that some moments transcended regulations and protocol. As James's superior officer, he should have been concerned about the breach of discipline. Instead, he felt proud of the young guard who had shown such courage in a completely different kind of battle. "Lance Corporal Wellington," Major Thompson said quietly, as he reached James's position, "I believe it's time for you to resume your patrol." James nodded crisply, grateful that his commanding officer's tone carried understanding rather than reprimand. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." "No," Major Thompson replied, glancing toward Rodriguez and the crowd. "Thank you, both of you." Rodriguez began to step back into the crowd, but found his path blocked by well-wishers who wanted to shake his hand, share their own military stories, and express their gratitude for what they had witnessed. An elderly Royal Navy veteran clasped Rodriguez's hand with surprising strength and said, "That was the finest display of military honor I've seen in 70 years of service, son." A group of American tourists surrounded him, but their attention felt different now. Not the casual interest in a uniform, but genuine respect for the person wearing it. A woman whose son was deployed in Syria pressed a small American flag pin into his palm and whispered, "Thank you for helping us remember what service really means." James resumed his patrol with renewed purpose, his steps somehow both more precise and more human than they had been before the encounter. As he walked his prescribed route, children waved at him with new enthusiasm, and adults watched with deeper appreciation for the tradition he represented. He could hear whispered conversations throughout the crowd as people tried to process what they had witnessed. The BBC News crew carefully interviewed several witnesses, gathering perspectives on what would later be called the salute that stopped London. A military historian among the tourists explained to anyone who would listen that such a public display of mutual respect between servicemen from different nations was unprecedented in the history of the changing of the guard ceremony. Rodriguez eventually extracted himself from the crowd and found a quiet spot along the palace perimeter to watch James complete his patrol. Every few minutes, their eyes would meet briefly as James's route brought him past that section of the courtyard. And each time, both men felt a renewed sense of purpose and healing. The connection they had formed would outlast this single encounter. As the official changing of the guard ceremony finally began, the crowd's attention shifted to the pageantry and precision of the full regiment. But many people continued to glance toward Rodriguez and James, understanding that they had witnessed something more meaningful than any scheduled performance. The ceremony felt richer somehow, infused with the authentic emotion they had just experienced. After the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Rodriguez approached the palace gates where James stood at attention. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead in accordance with his duties, but Rodriguez could see the slight smile at the corners of his mouth. "I'm Michael Rodriguez," the Marine said quietly, knowing that James couldn't respond while on duty, but needing to share his name with someone who had become important to him. Hours later, when James's shift ended, he found Rodriguez waiting near the palace entrance. They didn't need to say much. Warriors rarely do. They shook hands firmly, exchanged contact information, and made plans to meet for coffee during Rodriguez's remaining days in London. Their conversation was brief but profound, filled with the understanding that they had helped each other find something they both desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, their story spread far beyond London. The BBC footage was shared on social media platforms around the world, with millions of views and thousands of comments from veterans, active military personnel, and civilians who were moved by the display of mutual respect and human connection. Military leaders from both countries praised the incident as an example of the brotherhood that transcends national boundaries. Rodriguez returned to the United States with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to honor Jenkins's memory by living fully and serving others. He began volunteering with veteran support groups and discovered that sharing his story helped other soldiers process their own grief and guilt. The letter to Jenkins's parents finally got written and mailed, beginning a correspondence that brought healing to all involved. James requested and received permission to attend his brother's memorial service at Westminster Abbey 6 months later. Major Thompson personally ensured that the duty schedule was adjusted, understanding that some things are more important than routine obligations. James stood at attention during the ceremony, but this time his rigid posture contained grief, pride, love, and acceptance in equal measure. The little girl who had asked if they were sad became something of a celebrity in her school, proudly telling anyone who would listen about the day she talked to the soldiers who made everyone cry happy tears. Her innocent questions had catalyzed a moment of healing that reached far beyond what she could understand, but her parents made sure she knew she had done something important and brave. Years later, both men would look back on that morning in the palace courtyard as a turning point in their lives. They had found each other at exactly the moment when both needed to be reminded that strength and vulnerability, service and humanity, tradition and innovation could coexist. In the space between duty and compassion, they had discovered something eternal about the bonds that connect all those who choose to serve others. The courtyard returned to its normal routine, but the story lived on, a testament to the power of human connection, the healing that can occur when warriors recognize each other's wounds, and the truth that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words, in moments of perfect, shared understanding. His brother's memory, that breaking down would prove he wasn't worthy of the uniform. But this American Marine had shown him that strength and vulnerability could exist in the same moment, in the same person. The applause continued for several minutes, punctuated by cheers and expressions of gratitude in multiple languages. "Thank you for your service," called an American tourist. "God bless you both," shouted an elderly British woman. "Heroes," declared a group of French students. The international nature of the crowd had transformed the moment into something that transcended national boundaries. Rodriguez felt the weight of every person watching him, but more than that, he felt the connection to the guard, whose name he didn't know but whose pain he recognized completely. In Afghanistan, he had learned that sometimes the most important communications happened without words, and sometimes the greatest acts of courage happened in moments of perfect stillness. The standoff had become something larger than either man intended. They had become symbols for everyone watching, representatives of different nations, different military traditions, but united by the universal experience of service and sacrifice. The crowd sensed they were witnessing history, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what kind.